Hey everybody, welcome back to another flipped lesson here. And for this lesson on anatomy and physiology, we're going to be learning about the circulatory system. So make sure at the end of this video you have all your notes, any blanks filled in, and shoot an email if you have any questions. So starting off, right, let's jump right into it here. All right, so the circulatory system, also known as our cardiovascular system. And, we know this when we think about it. Obviously, we think about the heart is the first thing that comes to mind. But it's a really important system that's multifaceted, has a lot of moving parts, and really is super important because without this, there's so much that can't happen. All right. So again, it's also known as a circulatory cardiovascular system. We could use those interchangeably. And there's three major parts. All right. We have the heart, which is the big pump here in the middle. We have the blood vessels, right, which run all through our body, which is how the blood travels there in that third part, right? The blood, the fluid that fills the blood vessels and gets pumped around. Okay, so I always think about the circulatory system like a swimming pool, right? Same thing as a swimming pool. We have the pool with the pipes that move the water around. That would be like the blood vessels. We have the pump, all right, which is the heart, which moves or the filter, right, that moves that water through the pool. And then we have the water, which actually fills the pool, right, which would be like the blood. A couple things this system is responsible for: delivering oxygen, nutrients, and fluid to the entire body cells. So it's really important that all of our cells, to maintain homeostasis, right, they need to do cell respiration, they need oxygen to do that, and they give off waste. So that's what our circulatory system does for that. Okay, it takes carbon dioxide to the lungs to help expel that waste. And then other waste products go to the kidneys for excretion. And that's a really important process, which we'll talk about when we talk about our excretory system, because if you don't get rid of those wastes, you can get really toxic and you can get really sick. All right, there's other parts that go into that too, with fluid retention and how your body maintains fluid levels. Then finally, right, carrying hormone to target organs. So your circulatory system is like a highway, right? It's a great way to get hormones, chemicals, and other messages throughout your body really, really quickly. Okay. So let's start looking at the heart first. Okay. And we've talked about the heart already through our muscle chapter and both in tissues as well when we talk about muscle tissue, because that heart tissue, right, cardiac muscle cells are their own special type of cells. So we've talked about this a little bit. But the heart's a highly efficient organ, right, that pumps blood throughout the body. It's about the size of your fist. So if you were to make a fist, right, put it on your chest, that's where it would, it's about how big it would be. And it's right in the center of your chest, right? A lot of times people say, oh, my heart's on my left side because that's where, I put my hand when I do the Pledge of Allegiance. That's not entirely true. You can see it's offset just a smidge to the patient's left side here, but pretty much it's right in the middle of the chest, directly under the sternum. It sits between the two lungs. And again, like we just said, it's slightly to the left of the midline and it's posterior to the sternum. All right. And your heart's just a super cool organ because, from the moment you're born until the minute you die, like it literally never stops. It's always beating. And there's some numbers out there which can tell us how many beats, you might have in a lifetime. And it's an astronaut. I don't remember offhand, but it's quite a big number. Okay. So when we look at the heart, and we're going to get more in depth in this next week, right? But we divide the heart into four chambers, okay? And kind of we can split it kind of like a cross, right? Or the letter T. So the top two chambers are called the atria, and the lower two are called ventricles. And I always think about that like the alphabet, right? A comes before V. So atrium, ventricle, atrium, ventricle. All right, so we have atrioventricle top and bottom, and then obviously we have left and right. So the patient's left, the patient's right. And those two, left and right, they're separated by a wall down the middle. Okay, so really cool. So we could see our right atrium, right ventricle, left atria, left ventricle. And we're going to talk a little bit, and we'll talk more about how, based on what happens in the different chambers, right, we can see the anatomy is different. And just looking right away, you can see, right, the left ventricle is super, super muscular, and that makes a lot of sense. And then we look at the top here, right, and we have all these blood vessels on the top. So we have the vena cava that comes up, right, the descending, the ascending, so two major veins that come back. We have the pulmonary artery, pulmonary vein, the aorta, okay, which sends all of our blood out from our heart. And I already said there's 4 major valves, okay, 2 on each side. And these valves allow blood to flow in one direction every time it squeezes. So we can see we have tricuspid valve, bicuspid valve, mitral valve. And basically that valve, right, it allows blood to go through, all right, but it does not let it come backwards. And that's what keeps our circulatory system flowing in a one direction type of system. All right. So again, we have these, we talk about, right, the left and right side of the heart. So it functions as kind of 2 pumps, all right? And the right side of the heart pumps the blood to the lungs, all right? So again, we have the vena cava here, right? The superior and the inferior, right, coming from the top, so from our head. This comes from below us, right, our trunk, abdomen, legs. So it brings the deoxygenated blood, which has no oxygen, it's full of CO2, or not, I shouldn't say no oxygen, has minimal oxygen, less, right? Back to the heart, so into the right atrium, okay? And then from here, right, it goes to the right ventricle, and from the right ventricle, it goes to the pulmonary artery, right? This purple one, which goes to the lungs. And we know our lungs, right, have that gas that we need, oxygen. And that's where it goes out that way. All right, so the left side of the blood, and then when it returns, right, it returns through the pulmonary vein, going back to the heart, comes in here through the left atria, down to the left ventricle, right, atria, ventricle, and then from there it gets pumped out through the aorta to the rest of the body. Okay, the heart itself, right, because it's a giant muscle, it needs lots and lots and lots of oxygen, right? Because it's, like we said, it's always beating, blubbed up, blubbed up, blubbed up, blubbed up your whole life. So it needs lots of oxygen. So how does it get oxygen? Well, it has its own little arteries, all right, that come off from the first part of the aorta here, called the coronary arteries. And coronary refers to a crown, right? Like sitting on top of the head, right? The arteries sit on top of the heart, like a little crown. All right, and how does our heart actually work? And we've talked a little bit about this, right, when we talked about cardiac muscle cells or tissue, right, how they kind of have their own nervous system, all right? But they have a specialized electrical network that paces the heart, and we call this like a pacemaker, all right? And a pacemaker you've heard of probably is a commercial pacemaker where if somebody's having problems with their heart pumping efficiently and they might have what we call arrhythmias, we will actually implant a little electrical device in there that paces the heart to beat properly. But normally in everybody's heart that's healthy, right, that doesn't have these arrhythmias, you have these pacemaker cells. And we're going to talk more about this next week, but we can see there's different nodes, all right, and they basically depolarize or send an electrical signal that tells the heart to contract in that lubbed up, right, 2 parts. And that's why your typical heartbeat, if you ever heard it with a stethoscope, goes lubbed up, right? It's 2-part contraction. So all those cells can generate their own electrical current. And again, normally it does it all on its own. Okay, so let's get a little bit picture bigger now. So we talked about the heart, the pump. Let's talk about the tubes, right, of the swimming pool, or the blood vessels. So 3 major types of blood vessels, right, where blood travels through. We have arteries, right, which carry blood away from the heart to the lungs and to the body. And the opposite would be veins, right, which bring blood back to the heart. And generally, and this is just a representation here, right, we see arteries are bright red because they have oxygenated blood, right? So that blood came from the lungs, filled up with oxygen, get pumped through the heart, and then to the rest of the body. And we represent veins as blue because they're deoxygenated, right? They're coming back from the rest of the body up to the heart to get pumped to the lungs, and then back to the rest of the body again. Now, in reality, right, all your blood is red, right? If you were ever to cut yourself, and we could see different types of bleeding, if you're bleeding from an artery, it would be a brighter red, all right? But bleeding from a vein would not be blue blood, it would be just a much darker red. So where do these connect, right? Well, they connect to capillaries, all right? Connect arteries to veins. And capillaries are very tiny blood vessels where it's not these big giant tubes of blood that run through us. It's the tiniest little blood vessels where oxygen will actually diffuse through the cell into the cells that need need oxygen, like your muscle cells, right? And carbon dioxide will diffuse back into the blood. all right, and then go back to the lungs to get expelled. And your capillaries would be like if you ever like just braise your finger like a little scrape, you just kind of get that oozing, right? That would be capillaries. Cool. So again, arteries contain that oxygen-rich blood, and the only one, we mentioned this just before, the only one that doesn't have oxygen-rich blood would be your pulmonary artery, because again, an artery is any vessel that goes away from the heart. But remember, the right side of the heart has that deoxygenated blood that comes in, so right atrial, right ventricle, leaves through the pulmonary artery. It's going to the lungs to get oxygen. And then when it returns to the heart, it has fresh oxygen. So it's red now, right? And this would make sense. So this part here is your pulmonary vein, right? And your pulmonary vein is going to be your only vein that has oxygenated blood because it goes back to the heart, into the left atrial, left ventricle, and then out to the whole body. All right. So again, but for right now, right, we're talking about arteries, right? Most of the arteries that come out of your aorta all have oxygenated blood. They go to your whole body from your brain all the way down to your toes, bringing oxygen to all those important cells. All right, now we get to those capillaries when you get way out to the other side, to the smaller blood vessels. All right, and they're really tiny tubes. All right, and like I just said on the last slide, oxygen actually leaves the blood vessels, these capillaries, to go to your cells to give them oxygen, and carbon dioxide goes from your cells back into the capillaries, into the bloodstream, to go back to the lungs, all right, going this way, to get expelled, all right, because that's a waste. We don't want carbon dioxide inside our body. All right, so that's capillaries, the smallest ones. And then we have veins, all right? So veins bring blood back to the heart. And again, so you could say the vena cava, right? Superior, inferior vena cava coming into the right atrial, right ventricle. The only one that does not have or that does have oxygen, I should say, for veins is the pulmonary vein coming back. All right, now important to remember here, and this, if you ever take emergency med or if you know anything about CPR, all right, we say compressions. When we're doing CPR, we're pushing on the heart, really important part, and it keeps that blood flowing. Well, venous blood, right, so blood in your veins that's coming back, even though we say it's deoxygenated, it still has oxygen in it, just not as much as the blood in your arteries. That's why we could do CPR for a little bit of time and try and keep somebody alive. Okay, so cool. Those are veins. Awesome. All right, so now the last part to talk about here is blood. So there are four main components of blood. All right, we have, first, I'm actually going to start from the bottom here, and that's going to be plasma is first. All right, and your plasma is actually the liquid which suspends all the stuff. So again, the plasma is mostly liquid, right? Mostly water, right? Where all the stuff is suspended in your blood. Then we have we'll go up here, our platelets, all right? And platelets are like these little guys here that look pretty cool. And those are clotting factors. They help clot that blood and make it all sticky if it starts to leak so we don't lose it. Then we have our red blood cells, right? Which are these guys. We probably know them most. And those are the ones that carry oxygen. And we have our white blood cells. That's a really important part of our immune system to help fight invaders. All right, so let's just quickly talk through here the complete circuit through the body that one red blood cell would travel. All right, so again, starting from up here in the right atrium, we have blood coming in from the vena cava. So again, it's deoxygenated. We represent it as blue. The right atrium pumps it through a one-way valve into the right ventricle. All right, the right ventricle then pumps that blood through a one-way valve up into the pulmonary arteries. So again, the only artery without or deoxygenated blood. Pulmonary means lungs, so it's going towards the lungs. All right, once it gets to the lungs, all right, it gets there for blood. All right, through these little capillaries, it obtains oxygen. It lets go of carbon dioxide. It's then going to return to the heart through the pulmonary vein. Number 6 should be, right? From the pulmonary vein returned and goes to the left atrium of the heart. And then from there, right, it goes from a valve down to the left ventricle. And we can see this left ventricle has all this white stuff right here is muscle. It's huge muscle tissue for the heart. And it makes sense that our left ventricle is so big because that oxygen-rich blood that comes into the left ventricle gets pumped out through the aorta, and it's going to go out to our entire body. So it makes sense that our left ventricle is the biggest part of our heart because it's pushing all that blood through our body, pushing the circuit, going all the way up to our head, all the way down to our toes, perfusing the capillaries, and then coming back. All right. So arteries travel throughout the body, carrying the blood with that down to the capillaries. All right. And that's number 10 there. And then we have the narrow artery vessels carry blood to the smallest capillaries. All right, we're talking about here. Basically, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Once it's in the capillaries, nutrients enter the blood through the thin capillary wall to the cells. So oxygen leaves, any food, sugar, those types of things. Carbon dioxide and waste comes out. And again, our digestive system plays a role here, our respiratory system. Blood then travels back through the veins, gets bigger and bigger into bigger veins to return to the heart. Really cool. So that's the path through the heart. All right, now just two things to talk about here that you've probably heard of, right? So a pulse, right? So when we're talking about a pulse, that's when we're talking about, every time we feel a heartbeat. So, and you could do it right now. You could do it on your wrist. You could do your radial, right on your thumb side where our radius is. You know that from skeletal chapter, or you could do it up here on your carotid pulse. All right. Basically, you're feeling that dubbed up, dubbed up, dubbed up, right? You're feeling that heartbeat every time that it pumps, does a double contraction to move blood through the body and to move blood to the lungs to get up oxygen. And there's 5 places, right, where we can actually feel a pulse because our arteries are that close to our skin. And carotid, our neck, brachial, our arm, radial, our wrist, dorsalis, pedis, right, down on our foot, and our femoral down on towards our hip. And then finally, we have blood pressure. Okay, so that's a really important vital sign as well. And again, because our heart is a pump, right, it's exerting pressure. And maybe I'm sure we've all gone to the doctor, right? And gotten our blood pressure taken. So there's 2 numbers, all right? A really good blood pressure that we want to have is 120/80. So it's 2 numbers. The top number is the systolic pressure, and the bottom, the 80, is the diastolic pressure. So the systolic pressure is the pressure when our left ventricle squeezes the blood, right? Or does that contraction to get that blood moving throughout our whole body. That's when your heart exerts the most pressure. The diastolic pressure is when it's at rest, okay? And that's the lowest pressure in our body. So we're kind of looking at these 2 numbers, say, all right, what's the most pressure? What's the least amount of pressure? It's measured in millimeters of mercury. And so we say 120/80 because it's systolic over diastolic. And you can see some numbers here. So 120/80 is good, right? Maybe people who are hypertensive, hypertension, high blood pressure. It's a big side effect we see from a lot of fatty foods, clogged up arteries from cholesterol, a lot of salt, right, can do that. So it's not good if you're not healthy. And as you get up high, right, 140/90, 180/120, really, really not good. That's a severe emergency when you get really high. Down here, right, this is generally not good. We want to be a little bit lower. And good exercise and diet helps do that. So a really important vital sign here. You could also be hypotensive, right, low blood pressure, for a number of reasons. Bleeding, any type of shock, your blood vessels are opening up, they dilate, you lose pressure. And we'll talk about some of that. So another really important vital sign here of your circulatory system. And hey guys, well that's it. A little crash course on the beginning of our cardiovascular system. Make sure you got all your notes filled in, and we'll start getting more in depth on these parts of the circulatory system, and we'll see you guys in class.